Welcome to Jazz Piano Skills. I'm Dr. Bob Lawrence. It's time to discover, learn, and play jazz piano. It's always a great time, right, to discover, learn, and play jazz piano. And I hope everyone's been enjoying playing the improvisational patterns for the primary sounds of D flat, and of course exploring the various fingering patterns that require a conscious shifting of the hand to establish proper jazz articulation and to prepare your hand for continuous ascending and descending movement across the keyboard. Not an easy task, right? As I have said all along, it takes a serious commitment, tons of endurance, tons of patience to develop proper hand movement, right? In addition to nailing down the correct chord scale relationships. Wow. So if you are sticking to the program, I mentioned this a few weeks ago, if you are sticking to the program that we have been tackling since the start of the new year, wow, a huge congratulations. You are a member of a very small and determined group of people destined to achieve jazz success. All right, so today we're going to keep cranking. We're going to move forward and tackle the altered dominant sounds for D flat. The sharp 11, the flat 13, the flat 9, flat 13, and of course, the dreaded fully altered sound, the flat 9, sharp 9, flat 5, sharp 5. I say dreaded, but I mean that in a very good way, right? It's a great sound. It's my favorite sound. So, just as we've done this process for C, for F, for B flat, for E flat, for A flat. We're just working our way around the circle of fifths. So today you are going to discover essential jazz improvisation exercises. And you are going to learn developmental arpeggio and scale patterns of D flat altered sounds. And you're going to play 5 arpeggio and 5 scale patterns for the D flat dominant altered sounds of music. Again, the sharp 11, the flat 13, the flat 9, flat 13, and the dominant fully altered. So as I always like to say, right, regardless of where you are in your jazz journey, you may be a beginner, an intermediate player, an advanced player. You may be a seasoned and experienced professional. Regardless of where you are, you will find this Jazz Piano Skills podcast lesson exploring jazz improvisation exercises for D-flat altered sounds to be very beneficial. But before we dig in, I want to, as I do at the beginning of every podcast episode, I want to welcome new listeners to the Jazz Piano Skills podcast. And if you are indeed new to Jazz Piano Skills, I want to personally invite you to become a Jazz Piano Skills member. There are various membership plans for you to check out and to choose from. So visit jazzpianoskills.com to learn more about all of the various membership plans and the perks associated with each one. There are educational weekly podcast packets, illustrations, lead sheets, and play-alongs. There's a sequential jazz piano curriculum loaded with comprehensive courses available as well. Online weekly master classes, online interactive fakebook, a private Jazz Piano Skills online community, which hosts a variety of engaging forums. There's also unlimited private, personal, and professional educational support available. All of these perks are available and waiting for you, wanting to help you discover, learn, and play jazz piano. So when you have a moment, visit jazzpianoskills.com and become a member. Of course, if you have any questions once you get there and you're looking over the membership plans, please do not hesitate to reach out to me, contact me. I'm happy to spend some time with you and answer any questions that you may have. Okay, so now let's get to the question of the week. Now, this question comes from Luke Getty, living in Akron, Ohio. And Luke writes, I've been playing the piano for many years now, and I find myself practicing my scales the same way day after day, week after week, month after month, and year after year. I tend to think I'm pretty typical when it comes to scale practice, in that I practice my scales 1, 2, 3, and 4 octaves, straight up and straight down. I've gotten pretty proficient at playing scales, primarily major scales, but have become quite bored with playing them the same old way every time, right? Can you share some of the ways, patterns, that you used when you used to practice scales? Wow. All right. Great question, Luke. The very first thing I want to say is that I am more than happy to share with you some of the scale patterns that I use when practicing scales. Yes, when I practice scales, yet to this day, daily. In fact, I tell students all the time, get used to and get comfy with practicing scales and arpeggios, because you're going to be doing it for the rest of your life. And when you think about it, it only makes sense that scales and arpeggio practice would be a lifelong endeavor, because after all, melodies, right, regardless of the genre, are made up of ascending and descending scale and arpeggio motion. Therefore, the better, the more comfy you become with scales and arpeggios, the better, the more comfy your song playing becomes. Makes sense. So with that being said, it is also important to realize that melodies do not comprise of scale and arpeggio motion that just simply goes, as you put it, Luke, straight up and straight down. And melodies don't typically span 2, 3, or 4 octaves either. So I think, and I strongly suggest, that your scale and arpeggio practice should always be done in such a way that emulates how melodic lines are typically constructed, whether those lines are constructed compositionally or improvisationally, right? Now, this is not to say that you should stop practicing your scales straight up and straight down, right? I practice scales straight up and straight down, right, as well, but in much smaller geographical regions than you do, Luke. If you've been following the podcast for a while, you know that I am a huge believer in always determining a specific entry and destination point of every scale that I want to practice, right, when practicing scales. I love to use the root, the third, the fifth, and the seventh as my entry points. And I always select a destination point based upon a specific distance that I want to travel. Now, the distance may be the distance of a fifth, maybe a seventh, a ninth, 11th, or even a 13th. But regardless of the distance, I am never traveling beyond 2 octaves, never, which is not necessary for me to improve my technique skills, not at all. So all of this is to say that the first thing I would suggest for you to do, Luke, the very first thing, is to make sure that you are not always practicing your scales launching from the root. Ultimately, scale and arpeggio practice should make you root independent, right? This kind of practicing alone, becoming root independent, will breathe new life into your scale practice. Moving away from the root, thinking a distance to travel between the root and the 13th of the sound actively engages your ears, and all of a sudden, scale practice ceases to sound like scale practice and begins to sound more like melodic lines. So, Luke, continue to practice scales straight up and straight down using different entry and destination points. Get away from playing root to root. Okay? We're all taught to play scales in this way. And honestly, I'm not a fan. I'm just not a fan. Very little, if any, true representation of how melodic lines are composed and or improvised are represented in playing scales in this manner, right? So, and certainly there's no ear training benefit at all traveling from root to root. So likewise, be sure to practice your dominant, minor, half diminished, and diminished scales as well. Just don't stick with the major sound. Practice the scales of the other primary sounds that we have in music and that we've been dealing with all year, right? In addition to your major scales. So, all right. So now let me share with you 4 patterns that I continue to use to this day when practicing scales. In fact, I should do an entire podcast episode focusing on various scale patterns that I use, but let me just briefly go through these 4 that I tend to use frequently when practicing my scales. Okay, the very first pattern I use are triad shapes when practicing scales. So I will travel, again, my entry point. If my entry point is the root, I'm going to travel to the 7th using triads. And the very first thing I do is I play these shapes that I'm going to move through the sound of the scale. I play these shapes harmonically. So if I'm using a C minor sound, here's a C minor triad, followed by a D minor triad, followed by an E flat major triad, which, of course, the E flat major triad up on top has the note B flat. So my scale from the root to the 7th, C minor triad, D minor triad, E flat major triad. So I'll just simply play that's the scale using those shapes. So it'll sound something like this. Right? Just moving from the root up to the 7th using triad shapes. Now, if my entry point changes, maybe I'm going to go 3rd to the 9th using the same idea. So I'll practice first the pattern harmonically, E flat to F major to G minor, right? So I got my C minor sound, but I'm starting on the 3rd, work my way up to the 9th. Now when I turn that into melody, it sounds like this. Again, right? And I will move it to entry point of the 5th, entry point to the 7th. So I'm taking these triads, these harmonic shapes that are found within the scale, and I'm practicing ascending and descending using these triad shapes. The second way I like to approach scale practice is just playing in thirds. Again, from the root to the 7th. My entry point being the root, my destination point being the 7th. So again, with C minor, I'll just practice those thirds harmonically first. Right, I put the chord underneath it. Now I turn it into melody. And then come down. If I have a backing track or a play along that I'm using, I might put a nice swing groove on there and get something like a something like that. And again, I'll change my entry point. I'll go from the 3rd to the 9th or the 5th to the 7th using ascending and descending thirds. Again, coming from the scale. All right. Number 3, cyclical quadruplets. Okay. And I have the first set of cyclical quadruplets, what I call the skip sequence, right? So step meaning that I'm playing scale motion first, like from the root to the 3rd. And then returning to my C with the arpeggio motion down to the C. So I get this. Now I'll go to the 3rd of the scale. And now the 5th of the scale. Right, so I have 3 cyclical quadruplets. One off the root, one off the 3rd, one off the 5th. And I put my chord underneath it. again, ascending, descending. I have very specific target notes within my region of sound, from the root to the third to the fifth. That would be pattern number 3. And again, I would move these cyclical quadruplets from the 3rd to the 9th, from the 5th to the 11th, from the 7th to the 13th. Scale pattern number 4 is another cyclical quadruplet, but reversing it. Instead of doing step motion followed by a skip, I'm going to do skip followed by step, right? So now I get this. So I'm leaping from my root to the 3rd and descending back to my root using scale motion. Then I jump to my 3rd and I do the same thing. And then my 5th. So when I put it all together, I get again. Those 4 triads, thirds, cyclical quadruplet using step followed by skip sequence, and cyclical quadruplets, skip followed by a step sequence, right? Moving it through a specific region of the sound, either from the root to the 7th, 3rd to the 9th, 5th to the 11th, 7th to the 13th, right? You see that I use that format. I'm going to be using that format today. I've been using that format really all year long when practicing my scales and demonstrating the various improvisational patterns that we're about to explore again today. So Luke, great question. I hope these ideas breathe some new life into your scale practice. And of course, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to let me know. I'm happy to spend some time with you and provide further clarification as needed. And you know what? I think it will make a good podcast episode here in the near future to spend some time going over various ways in various patterns to use to practice scales other than, as you said, Luke, moving straight up and straight down. Okay, let's discover, learn, and play jazz piano. Let's get after these jazz improvisation exercises for altered D-flat dominant sounds. As I mentioned in previous podcasts, in fact several times, that students struggle with improvisation more often than not because of poor fingerings. It's not because of a lack of talent, lack of skill. It's not because of a lack of theory familiarity, but just simply due to immobile hands resulting from poor fingerings. And this is exactly why we have been devoting this entire year to this, devoting our time to this issue, right? And trying to answer some very important questions like what constitutes good fingerings? What should we look for when establishing fingerings for a certain musical phrase? What should we be trying to accomplish with our fingerings? Is there always a fingering option that will reign supreme, right, over other options? And of course, the golden rule of fingerings, right? Do we really, really, truly try to avoid our thumb using our thumb on a black note or launching a musical line with our thumb on a black note, right? So the whole point, again, of our journey this year is to establish some definitive answers to these types of questions and to circumvent any type of fingering dilemma that we may have that is holding us back from developing mobile hands to allow us to easily move around on the keyboard and to improve our improvisational skills, right? So all of this, of course, sounds fantastic, right? Because deep down, I know, that if you can get your right hand to easily move around on the keyboard, you'll be able to play the tunes and you'll be able to improvise and embellish them with your musical ideas. You'll be able to play jazz. And this is the entire point, right? This is the objective of this podcast episode. And certainly this is the objective that we have, that we've set out to achieve from the start of the year, right? We want to simplify our fingering approach. We want to establish a fingering conviction, if you will, that will allow us to begin successfully practicing and establishing fingerings for all of our scales, for all of our arpeggios, 60 chords, using various patterns like the patterns I just shared following Luke's question. And in doing so, we solidify finger muscle memory that ultimately this good fingering muscle memory ultimately frees us up to think about musical expression, musical emotion, musical articulation, musical creativity. So it's exciting. So with all that being said, let's get down to business. Today's educational agenda is as follows. Number 1, we are going to explore jazz improvisation exercises for D-flat altered sounds. Number 2, we will play essential D-flat altered arpeggio patterns that you need to discover, learn, and play from the root to the 13th of the sound using a root, 3rd, 5th, and 7th entry. Geez, have you heard that before? Number 3, we will play essential D-flat altered scale patterns that you need to discover, learn, and play from the root to the 13th of the sound using a root, 3rd, 5th, and 7th entry. And number 4, I will be playing all jazz improvisation exercises today using the D-flat 7 fully altered sound. And number 5, I will be playing all jazz improvisation exercises, as always, for right now at least, using a traditional swing groove, nice and relaxed, 110, at a tempo of 110. So, if you are a Jazz Piano Skills member, I want you to hit the pause button right now. I want you to take a few minutes to access, download, and print your podcast packets, the illustrations, the lead sheets, and the play-alongs. Again, your membership, if you have a trio membership or above, your membership grants you access to all of the educational podcast packets for every weekly podcast episode. And as I mentioned, every week, you need to be using these podcast packets. You need to have them in your hands when listening to this episode. And of course, you need to have these podcast packets sitting on your piano at home when practicing as well. So, if you're listening to this podcast on any of the popular podcast directories, such as Apple or Google, Amazon, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pandora, the list goes on and on and on, then be sure to go directly to jazzpianoskillspodcast.com. That's jazzpianoskillspodcast.com to access, to download your podcast packets. And you will find the active download links in the show notes. One final but very significant message that I include in every episode. If you are listening to this podcast episode right now and listening to the jazz improvisation exercises for D-flat altered sounds, and you are thinking that, these skills that we're about to discover, learn, and play are way over my head, then I would say to you, that's okay. Relax. Sit back. Breathe in. Breathe out. No worries. Just continue to listen and continue to grow your jazz piano skills intellectually just by listening. That's it. Just listen. Every new skill is over our heads when first introduced, right? But this is how we get better. And we have to place ourselves right smack dab in the middle of conversations where we are hearing things that we have never heard before. We are hearing words that we have never heard before. And in doing so, we are forced to grow intellectually. And I say it all the time, that musical growth begins upstairs mentally, conceptually first, before it can come out downstairs physically in your hands, right? So if it's confusing upstairs, it will be confusing downstairs. So simply listen to sort things out conceptually. Listen first to discover and learn. The play, as it always does, will come in time. I guarantee it. Okay, now that you have your lead sheets in front of you, in your hands, I want to point out a few things. You will see that lead sheets 1 through 4 deal with arpeggio motion. Lead sheets 5 through 8 deal with scale motion. You'll also notice that the jazz improvisation exercises are the same for all 4 altered D-flat dominant sounds. Same exercises for the sharp 11, flat 13, flat 9, flat 13, and of course the fully altered flat 9, sharp 9, flat 5, sharp 5 sound. The exercises, though, of course, are modified to reflect the proper sound. You will also notice that my suggested fingerings are included for every note of every exercise for every sound. And of course, you can modify the fingerings slightly, but as always, be very careful. Remember, fingerings are what allow us to play with proper jazz articulation, and these fingerings have intentional hand shifts built into them, right? Built into them. So you may be inclined to change the fingerings because you think, wait a minute, I can remove this hand shift and it'll be a lot easier. Yeah, you think that, but you're actually defeating the whole purpose of what we're trying to accomplish here by doing that. So just be careful with the fingerings. You can make slight modifications. However, just keep in mind that your ease here may actually just end up making it harder for you to play with proper jazz articulation and fail to accomplish the objective that we've set out to achieve. So I'm just throwing all that out to you, caution to the wind here, right? Just be careful. Okay, let's dig in. I want you to grab lead sheet 4, scale 4, and lead sheet 8, skill 8. These lead sheets deal with the fully altered D-flat dominant sound. Scale 4 deals with the D-flat altered sound using arpeggio motion. Scale 8 deals with the D-flat 7 altered sound using scale motion. Now, all of you know the D-flat fully altered scale is a very strange scale to try to notate, to try to write out, to write using music, typical music nomenclature. It gets very confusing with, double flats, especially in these keys, right? Double flats and natural signs and so forth. So I've been wrestling with how to best approach this altered sound throughout the entire year, and I think I have it solved here. So you'll notice right away our entry points have now changed. I typically use the root 3rd, 5th, and 7th, but you'll notice that the first entry point that I'm using is the flat 9, then I'm using the 3rd, then the sharp 5 entry, and then the root entry, and in that order. In other words, what I'm doing is I'm building my patterns, my shapes, launching from one of the altered sounds. I've chosen to use the flat 9, to launch from the flat 9 sound with my demonstrations today. I could have very easily done this launching from the sharp 9 sound, or the flat 5 sound, or the sharp 5 sound. Okay, and I'm going to talk and discuss this in more detail in the masterclass on Thursday evening as to why I'm doing it this way. But it keeps things, I think, really clean notation-wise, and I think it's even a better way to approach dealing with the altered sound when we put our focus on launching from either one of the primary altered sounds, the flat 9, the sharp 9, or the flat 5, or the sharp 5. In this case today, we're launching always from the flat 9. So you'll see there, pattern 1, letter A, we have our D-flat 7 fully altered sound. I'm launching with a D natural, which is the flat 9, going to the 3rd, going to an A natural, which is a sharp 5, and then the C sharp, which is really the D flat, which is the root. But you see how it looks normal to the eyes as you're looking at the lead sheet? It just looks right. And even more importantly, it even sounds great because we're really incorporating these altered sounds, these altered nines and altered fives into our arpeggios. So with that being said, I'm going to bring the ensemble in, and keep in mind that the fully altered sound, right, there's a lot of tension. And we're isolating this sound so it's not resolving anywhere, right? So it's not coming from some chord and it's not resolving to a chord. So we've intentionally taken this sound that is packed with these alterations that create tension. That's what alterations do. They create tension, and that tension ultimately wants to resolve. However, when we're practicing it, we've isolated this sound so it's not resolving anywhere. So some of you, your ears might be going, whoa, this doesn't sound good. And others who are familiar with this sound might be going like, wow, this sounds awesome. So just keep that in mind. So I want to bring the ensemble in. Let's listen to letter A. We're scale 4, lead sheet 4. I'm going to play through each arpeggio, launching from the flat 9, the third, the sharp 5, and the root, just as notated, 4 times each. Let's check it out, and then we'll go from there. Here we go. Now I think that sounds awesome. I love it. This is fabulous, and I think this is a great way to approach this fully altered sound. So now if you look at letter B, we're going to use the same entry points. Flat 9 as our first entry point, the third, then the sharp 5, and then the root. Okay? And our arpeggio now, instead of just being a straight ascending arpeggio, we get a little contour to our shape. So we have a little, starting to sound a little more improvisational, but we have our hand shifts in there. Pay careful attention to these fingerings. Even with these short little motifs, we have the hand shifting and getting used to moving across the keys, right? So let's bring the ensemble back in and let's listen to letter B. Here we go. See, by now your ears may be adjusting to this fully altered sound and actually may be enjoying it. I hope so. It's a great sound, especially, as I mentioned earlier, especially when it comes from, say, a 2 chord to this fully altered 5 chord resolving to the 1 chord. It's gorgeous. So when we practice it, however, as we do with every skill, we tend to isolate that skill, isolate that sound, and practice it. And in doing so with the altered sounds, it can be tough to digest orally when you first start doing this kind of practice with this scale. So now if you look at letter C, again, same entry points, flat 9, 3rd, sharp 5, root. Okay? Now we have even more contour to our lines, and the line is such that we have to be shifting our hands, and even at times maybe find ourselves with our thumb, launching with our thumb on a black note with the root entry, just FYI, that root entry in our last motif. So let's bring the ensemble back in. Follow along with your lead sheet. Circle, make note of those hand shifts there in your lead sheet. And let's listen to this and see what we think. Here we go. Okay, on to letter D, and guess what? As always, 8th note triplets. We have to have 8th note triplets in here somewhere, right? As we do every month in dealing with our primary and altered sounds. So here we have our 8th note triplets. Again, same entry points, flat 9, 3rd, sharp 5, and then finally the root entry. So let's, as always, bring the ensemble back in. Always a good idea to circle those fingerings where the hand shifts are taking place. And let's follow along and listen to these 8th note triplets, again, launching from the flat 9, the 3rd, the sharp 5, and the root. Here we go. we are down to our final motif using arpeggio motion for our D flat fully altered sound, letter E. And again, we're sticking with our same entry points, right? Flat 9, third, sharp 5, and root. And once again, I mentioned this earlier. If we could do the same process with our entry point, our initial entry point being the sharp 9 instead of the flat 9, or the flat 5, or the sharp 5. Of course, I only have time today in this podcast episode to zero in on launching from one of the alterations, and I've chosen the flat 9. So letter E, we have the flat 9 entry, followed by the third entry, followed by the sharp 5, and then the root. Okay, back to eighth note motif that stretches into the second measure, so our ideas just keep getting a little bit longer, right? But again, we have plenty of hand shifting taking place to create hand mobility and to develop good muscle finger memory. So let's bring the ensemble in and let's check out letter E. Here we go. All right, on to scale movement, scale motion. So grab lead sheet 8, skill 8. We have 5 patterns that we are going to deal with again here using scale motion. And again, the entry points are going to be the exact same. We're going to launch from our flat 9, from our third, from our sharp 5, and from our root. Okay? And as I did with the arpeggios, I'm going to play each melodic motif couple times, 4 times before moving on to the next one, right? So you have plenty of time to make any notes on your lead sheets with regards to the fingerings or any personal notes that you want to make that will help you as you return to these patterns for practicing at home. So let's bring the ensemble in. Let's kick things off. We're just going to use straight ascending scale motion for letter A. From each one of our entry points. Flat 9, third, sharp 5, and the root. So here we go. Let's check it out. So now on to letter B, and just as we did with the arpeggio, now our scales are going to have a little bit more contour to the shapes, right? So still scale motion, but we continue to add a little bit more contour. So letter B, right? So let's bring the ensemble in, and let's listen to letter B. Of course, we're staying with the same entry points, right? We have our flat 9, we have our third, sharp 5, and our root. All right, so here we go. Check it out. Well, if we had to deal with the eighth note triplet with arpeggios, we're going to deal with eighth note triplets using scale motion. So look at letter C, and you're going to see a lot of repetition in the fingerings, a lot of hand shifting, but a lot of repetition in the fingerings. In fact, I think when you sit down to actually practice letter C with these eighth note triplets, I think you're going to actually enjoy how you sound using these fingerings. So let's bring the ensemble in. Let's listen to our eighth note triplets with a flat 9 entry, third, sharp 5, and root entry. Okay? Here we go. Let's have some fun. As you know, each of these melodic motifs, I tend to stretch the motif into a longer line with the arpeggios, and the same with the scales. And so you can see there that with those eighth note triplets we just completed, we stretched across the bar line in the measure 2, and letter D and letter E will continue to lengthen as well. So taking a look at letter D, we're back to eighth notes. Again, a straight eighth note motif, But our entry points, as always, will remain the same. Our flat 9, our third, our sharp 5, and our root. All right, so pay careful attention to the fingerings as always. And let's have a little fun with letter D. Here we go. All right, so we are now approaching letter E, our last scale improvisational exercise for the D flat 7 altered sound with our flat 9 entry, third entry, sharp 5, and our root entry. I think you're going to find as you practice this scale, this sound, this pattern, with changing our entry points, just due to the nature, the quirkiness of this scale when you try to, this sound, when you try to use traditional music nomenclature to notate it. I think you're going to find that you see this sound easier, you hear it easier, and of course you play it easier because we've shifted our entry points to focus on launching always from one of the altered sounds, the flat 9, the sharp 9, the flat 5, or the sharp 5. Today, as I mentioned earlier, I'm launching everything from the flat 9. I'm building our entry points off of the flat 9, okay? Moving in thirds from the flat 9. That's why we're going from the flat 9 to the third. And then the third takes us to the sharp 5, and the sharp 5 takes us to the root. Moving in thirds, right? Launching from the flat 9. So let's attack our last motif, our last improvisational line today, which again, eighth notes, and again stretches across the bar line to count 2 of measure 2. So here we go. Let's have some fun with letter E. All right, we did it, right? We did it. We attacked the fully altered sound today for D flat, which in and of itself can be kind of intimidating when you first hear it, right? D flat 7, fully altered sound, flat 9, sharp 9, flat 5, sharp 5. But I think we've done it in such a way that's going to allow us to approach the study of the fully altered sound moving forward in a much easier and simplistic way. And of course, we'll talk more about all of this in the Thursday evening masterclass. Well, we have done it again. We have unpacked a ton of information in one very short and very fast hour. Now, even though I played the jazz improvisation exercises today using the fully altered dominant sound only, be sure to practice these exercises for the dominant flat, for the sharp 11, for the flat 13, and for the flat 9, flat 13 sounds as well. Right? They are all laid out for you in your Lead Sheets podcast packet with fingerings included. And remember, you can modify the fingerings slightly, but be careful, right? Just be careful. You have a ton to practice this week, right? So use your practice time wisely. Next week, we will explore another bebop tune, right? Closely examine the various melodic shapes and their fingerings found within the tune itself. Once again, I want to encourage all of you Jazz Piano Skills members out there, use your podcast packets, especially this week, with the fully altered sound and the different entry points that we are using, right? Use your illustrations to help you get these sounds sorted out conceptually. And of course, there are play-alongs for you to use when practicing as well, right? These are educational tools that will help you gain a mastery of this sound, of this jazz piano skills, not only conceptually, physically, but musically, right? And always, most importantly, be patient. Developing mature professional jazz piano skills always takes a lot of time. So begin structuring your practicing, your improvisation development after the playing demonstrations that I modeled for you today in this podcast episode. And I guarantee it that you will begin to see, feel, and hear your progress. Well, I hope you have found this Jazz Piano Skills podcast lesson exploring jazz improvisation exercises for D-flat altered sounds to be insightful and to be beneficial. And don't forget, if you are a Jazz Piano Skills Ensemble member, I'll see you online Thursday evening. We have a ton to talk about during the masterclass. That's going to be 8 p.m. Central Time to discuss, this podcast episode lesson in detail, and of course to answer any questions that you may have about the study of jazz in general. If you have any questions between now and then, you can always reach me by phone. My number here at the Dallas School of Music, 972-380-8050. My office extension is 211. If you prefer to reach out using email, my email address is drlawrence, drlawrence at jazzpianoskills.com. Or you can use the nifty little SpeakPipe widget that is literally nestled on every page of the Jazz Piano Skills website. Well, there is my cue. That's it for now. And until next week, enjoy the jazz improvisation exercises for the D-flat altered sounds. And most of all, have fun as you discover, learn, and play jazz piano.